to welcome everyone to another episode of the Business Science Magazine podcast. I'm here with Thor Story. Did I pronounce that correctly?
You got it, yep.
Excellent, excellent. So we're lucky enough to have Thor with us today, and I'd like to introduce him properly. So here's a quick excerpt from Thor's bio. Thor has various learning and development positions at the Kellogg Company, 12 for the last 10 years, and is currently the Director of Global Learning. He has successfully led large-scale L&D initiatives and plays the role of a performance consultant to ensure learning initiatives are closely aligned to and in support of business strategy and effective and continuous learning in the workplace. Originally from Iceland, Thor moved to the US to pursue a graduate degree in psychology and graduated from Western Michigan University with a master's degree in IO psychology and a PhD in psychology with a focus on organizational behavior management and learning. Prior to that, Thor worked as a behavior therapist, implementing intervention programs for children with behavior problems, learning difficulties, autism, and other developmental disabilities. Thor is passionate about evidence-based and performance-driven learning solutions that are closely tied to defined business outcomes. He is also interested in exploring how innovations in L&D can impact organizations' ability to foster a thriving learning culture. So Thor, I was really excited to meet and talk with you today, and I thought it would be good if we could start off with your story. Where did it all begin? How did you make the decision to move from Iceland over to the United States?
Yeah, it kind of the trigger for me was technically behavior analysis. So I went to the University of Iceland where I got my bachelor's degree, and during my time there, I really got into behavior analysis and gravitated towards that approach, philosophy, science, if you will. And one thing led to another, and I took on a job as a behavior therapist or implementing a kind of ABA therapy for kids with autism. And that kind of got the ball rolling. Really got into that. It was fascinating to see changes happen, through the implementation of these programs and seeing impact we're having through these methods. And at some point, I really thought that that would be my career. I would be doing some sort of kind of more of a quote unquote clinical work with that population. But kind of when I looked at it, it was like, okay, thinking 20 years out, where do I see myself? And I couldn't really see where, what my career path would look like, because I saw myself doing one or two things, maybe run a small consulting gig in this space or being a therapist, so it was sort of limited the way I looked at it. So very passionate about learning, passionate about behavior analysis. So I said, okay, let's shift gears here. And how does this apply in organizational settings, right? And it started to look around, and I was aware of friends and around me had gone to the U.S. for graduate programs in behavior analysis, and I kind of got into more of being interested in OBM and decided to apply for a few programs here, and ended up at Western Michigan, which is one of I would say probably the mecca of OBM and a lot of behavioral analytic practices, I would say, and research and thought leaders. So graduate school brought me to the U.S. and studied with a lot of great people there. Alice Dickerson, Eric Fox, Heather McGee, others that helped me kind of build my skill set and kind of grow me into who I am as a behavior analyst, I guess. I was fortunate enough, even on my thesis committee, I had Jack Michael. So it was an honor to have him part of my education. So and then probably I think it was 2 years into the PhD, or 1 year into the PhD part of the program, I got an opportunity to join Kellogg in an internship capacity. And at the time they were starting to implement more of kind of e-learning, and they were going online. This is 12 years ago, and they were early in that. So I brought in some instructional design expertise and some technology kind of practices, and started to build out some courses and programs. And one thing led to another. I've had now several opportunities, several different roles within the organization. Most of the time, it has been with some sort of with a learning hat, with a learning focus, an L&D or or whether it's in sales or global business services, and now in my current role as head of global learning. So it's been a great great journey so far. But again, it kind of started, when you think about the trigger initially was, wow, this is fascinating, this science behind human behavior and these principles. And I just got into it. But then, I started more in kind of the autism space, but eventually brought me to, into corporate America. So who would have thunk, right?
Well, I have to ask, because, you mentioned it a couple of times that you were really turned on by behavior analysis. And I felt the exact same way when I got into behavior analysis. I think like a lot of people, I got into psychology. I wanted to learn about myself and learn about my own behavior. And then I stumbled on behavior analysis by accident. So how did you stumble upon behavior analysis, and what turned you on with behavior analysis or behavior science?
Yeah, there were a couple of professors at the University of Iceland who, one of them is a behavior analyst, Dr. Sigurðardóttir. She is probably the one who turned me on, and I took kind of a basic kind of course in behavior analysis, and then I took another one that was more around the methodology and research and designs and things like that. And a couple of other folks who were really the way they kind of framed it up, the way they explained it, and some of the literature I got into was like, wow, this is something you have observable changes. You have principles, you have approaches, methods to really help make meaningful, socially significant changes in people's lives. So it was just, it attracted me more than some of the more of kind of the cognitive approaches where you didn't have the tangibles, right? There was something missing there for me. But I still remember when I really got into looking at research and seeing those changes that were happening, and they were valid and they were reliable versus let's have some let's create some hypothetical constructs and generate some survey research around it. It was not my area of interest. So it's really the data and the impact that pulled me in.
You mentioned too that that you didn't just have an interest in behavior science, but also a more specific interest in organizational behavior management. So something I always like to ask all of our guests is how they define organizational behavior management, because I feel like everybody functionally defines it the same way, but uses different terms. So I'm curious, how do you define organizational behavior management?
Yeah, I'm probably not far off of the kind of the standard definition, if there is one. It would be a practical application of principles of behavior and systems analysis in organizational settings, with the goal of improving performance and solving business problems. That's probably how I would frame it up, and I guess it's close to others, but there are different versions of this, I guess, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can always tell who mentored who, because as soon as you said systems analysis and things like that, I'm thinking Heather McGee and BSAs and things like that. So
there you go. Yep.
How do you feel like OBM differs from some of the other methodologies out there, like IO psychology and things like that?
I think it's just I think all of the different areas claim some sort of scientific foundation, but I think behavior analysis brings that very strong scientific foundation based on research. We have clear definitions of what we're of the subject matter, right? Versus hypothetical constructs. And for me, I think the OBM helps cutting through the noise, if you will. So sometimes I find myself in meetings with leaders, and whether it's in HR leaders or business leaders, and they have high level visions and talk about the future, and then okay, how do we get this done, right? And then they start to throw out like all these vague terms around capabilities and this and that, but it never gets to the level of okay, let's talk behavior here, right? It's very hard for me to as a learning professional or an HR professional to action against things that it's very ambiguous, if you will. So I think for me, what OBM helps is really to cut through the noise and point to the levers that we have at our disposal to make meaningful change. I think that is probably the differentiator.
Do you feel like So I always felt, and it's interesting because so many behavior analysts went the same path, like you did and like I did, where you start in therapy and then you move out into OBM and systems and things like that. And when I started in behavior analysis, which was about 17 years ago now, I felt like the term behavior was bad. So it was associated with bad behavior, and it was just,
Right.
it wasn't a friendly term, especially in business. However, I've noticed that in the past few years, maybe 4 or 5 years, that so many different corporate organizations are opening up to that term, specifically in learning L&D and research and development. Technology is another big area where I see that it's opened up. Do you feel like corporate America or the corporate world in general is a little friendlier to our science and just behavior in general?
I think that's a great point. That's exactly how I feel, right? A few years ago, the behavior, you know, that was a term that I didn't use overtly a lot, right? But, you know, especially with more, I'm not sure if it's kind of people data that is driving some of this, because now it's become readily available, looking at skills, more looking at, you know, future work. You know, everything is changing, right? 50% of jobs will be obsolete in the next X years. I don't know, you know, so organizations are more and more like, okay, what do we need to do? What are the things that people need to learn, and what are the new skills and behaviors? You know, so that I think we're getting back to the point, like people are understanding the importance of being able to talk behavior, and how do we, you know, change, build, you know, and support behavior to support people in their, you know, and going through these dramatic, radical transformations within business and broadly speaking globally. So I'm getting a lot of that. For example, we recently launched a new a competency model for our leaders, or for everybody at Kellogg really. And competencies are essentially clusters and summary labels of behaviors, right? But we get actually to a point, and we're talking about developing people based on certain behaviors. Now, we can argue how good those definitions are, but they go down to a level of describing certain actions, certain behaviors that are really, we can start to measure, and we can start to build and help kind of facilitate the you know, people growing those skills. So I would say that yes, I'm talking behavior, using that word is perfectly okay.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting too, because you can always tell where somebody, the specialty or the specialized area where somebody works, because you keep talking about learning and development and skills, and that's your focus right now. And like you said earlier, that you've always had a focus at Kellogg in learning and development or training. So I'd like to segue into corporate learning for a few minutes, and talk a little bit about instructional design. And some of the experience that I've had working in the area of instructional design over the course of the past couple of years is there's a huge focus on digital technology and not necessarily behavior analytic technology or learning methodologies. So could you talk a little bit about that, some of the struggles that you've gone through? Have you noticed that as well?
I have. That's interesting. I get probably contacted by, you know, 30 plus vendors every week that are trying to sell us a platform, a digital solution to fix my problems. And then they throw out some data and like, we did this at this, you know, company XYZ, and they got like 90% reduction in turnover and this and that, and all these fancy, very impressive numbers. There is typically not, you know, I do question them, but there's a lot of focus on the shiny objects, the thing that is supposed to solve everything. But a lot of times when you, okay, yeah, interesting solution. Tell me more about where does this come from? How do you think about this from a behavior change standpoint? What are the kind of the mechanisms? What's the research? And in some cases, yeah, people do have, you know, they cite some, you know, neuroscience and other things. But a lot of times, I think, and I try to do this, I try to be cognizant of like, what are we trying to solve for? And we can't just throw out a cool digital platform. We need to understand how that works in the context of the business environment, in the context of people's behaviors, and what's driving that. And I think all too often, right, you know, I go to conferences and I think we sometimes move too far from when we talk about learning, what is actually happening, and how do we define learning, right? It's very basic. but sometimes it gets into too much of the activities that are supposedly drive learning and enable learning, but doesn't always happen because, to your point, the kind of the methodology behind it and it's not always there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Do you find, and it's interesting that you were talking about those vendors. I'm not sure if you attend some of the learning conferences like the Association for Talent Development and Training Mag conferences. So I'll go to some of those events, and they have so many vendors there with digital technology platforms like you were talking about. And I noticed a lot of them focus on group statistics as opposed to individual behaviors. So is that a challenge that you run into on a regular basis?
It is, and I'm an advocate for what I call, and this term, like personalization of learning. I mean, it's everybody's talking about that, but what does that truly mean? So it is, group statistics can help you sell things, and it can help you you can infer certain things from it. Okay, we're on the right path because we're seeing a trend here with something. But at the end of the day, it's how do we break that down and take it down to the individual level? So some of the things we're looking at now here at Kellogg is how do we get better data at the individual level, right? In terms of their engagement with certain learning activities, with ultimately their outputs and behavior change, which is very difficult to capture. But that's really what I would like to see, because you can't say with your solutions that we're launching this program or platform technology. There's never going to be one size fits all. There's one size fits one, which kind of brings us back, which is the essence of behavior analysis, is you need to be specific enough. Now, I can tell you that we don't have, we do have a lot of kind of individual data, but we typically do aggregate them and share them out. But then the question is, where does the data come from? Because a lot of the data that in the research, when you look at, a lot of the vendors, it's all survey based, right? They're just asking people. And even what I find fascinating, and is one of my pet peeves, and people here laugh when this comes up, I'm not a really big fan. And the 70-20-10 model for how we learn, it's like there's no foundation for that. How they came up with that, there was like 40 years ago, 40 senior leaders at a company had them fill out a survey. To this day, people are still referring to that model, and there's nothing behind it. So I think there's some kind of conceptually valid things in that. Yeah, not all learning happens through courses. There's a lot of exposure to others and interactions and on the job. Yes, I get it. But to say that there's research and there's, because the foundation is very weak. So again, individual versus group, it is challenging when you're at a company that has 30,000 employees, right? How do you get after that? But at the end of the day, if individuals have access to their own data, that can motivate, that can act as motivating operations for ongoing learning. It can set up some reinforcers along the way. So if I, as a learning, have access to how I'm doing, I think that can definitely be beneficial. But we don't.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I wanted to use that as a jump-off point to discuss the LinkedIn Learning Initiative that you spearheaded. So can you tell us a little bit about that, why you decided to go with LinkedIn Learning, and how it's been going?
Yeah, it's been a fun project. So again, really what led us to deploy that across all of our salaried employees was going back to the future of work and how rapidly things are changing. So, a few years ago, and kind of the traditional way of providing learning solutions here for the masses was, we went through, identifying needs and going through the instructional design. And then, 6-7 months later, we launched a program, and then we ran that for some time, and then it became obsolete. And let's go back to square one and do the next program, right? And that doesn't work, right? Things and the demand for organizations to be able to deliver learning solutions and having meaningful impact through them is changed. Going back to what I talked about, one size fits all, we wanted to make sure we were able to provide employees across the enterprise with something that they could that would be targeted for them. If they can have access to a massive learning library, and with some simple kind of rules built into the platform, they would get recommendations. Hey, you are in HR. These are some courses and topics that are trending for your profession. hey, you have this title, here's some things, you're at this company. So it's how do we cater to people's needs in the moment through the platform in this case, they're able to say, let me know what might be helpful. There are also some additional tools that allow us to see, benchmark against industries. What skills and behaviors are trending, and what are the courses against those that we can kind of recommend or push out? So we took a approach where it's not like provide this as a, hey, here's your library card, go and figure out what you need. We tried to be a little bit deliberate and pre-curate courses and recommend based on our business objectives and where we're at. But at the end of the day, it's about empowering the individual employees to find their paths and find what they can benefit from. So it's been people embraced this because they didn't have much, so they were kind of starving for this content. And we're promoting the timeliness of learning, right? Again, going back to the old school model, I'm going to sign up for a course and giving feedback. I sign up today. The course is going to be delivered 3 months from now or 2 months from now. But guess what? I have my conversation with an employee next week or today, or I need it now. So how do we do a better job of the immediacy of how you consume and learn, and then you can immediately apply it. So it goes to kind of the point of individualizing it, if you will.
Yeah, I love that. I love personalized learning. That's nice. I might steal that phrase and use that.
It's used all over, so go right ahead.
Before we get off that topic, could you talk a little bit about the 4-stage process that I read about? So ad hoc, formal, agile, and integrated learning. Yeah.
So you can view this as our kind of maturity, right? And you have, if you're in HR, if you're in various or you're in IT, whatever, organizations tend to have this is our maturity model from where we are today, from where we want to go in the next 5-6 years, what our strategy is pushing us towards, right? So I just looked at the literature and what's out there and available and kind of borrowed from some of that in terms of defining if we're going to move the needle on getting to where we want to be which is a learning culture with truly that's integrated. You have data-driven learning that pushes content to you when you need it, and it's all that kind of almost like futuristic stuff that we would like to get to. That's the end, or that 4th stage that we have, what we call integrated learning. But we need to understand where we are today, right? We provide courses, we do some basic tracking, we know that we're maybe having some impact, blah, 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 blah. Then we move into more of a little bit more advanced stage. And then we get more and more sophisticated and effective, efficient, I guess. So this whole 4th stage was more like, how do we define each stage of our kind of quote unquote journey? So that was really the reason behind it. It's basically just a maturity model from going to here, basic, to going to something sophisticated. That allows us to put together strategies. Okay, if we're going to move from one phase to the next, what do we need to do? What's the technology? What's the strategy? What are the principles and guidelines that allow us to progressively move through those stages?
Excellent. I'd like to take a quick left turn here. You've mentioned something a couple of times. You talked about the future of work, and you talked about where some trends are going in the future, that a lot of jobs are going to be made obsolete. What are some of the trends that you see in instructional design and learning and development? Where do you think those industries are going to be in 10 or 15 years?
Yeah, I think, obviously going back to technology, right? We were talking about there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of solutions, but I do truly think that artificial intelligence and data and easier access is truly going to revolutionize this. So I think, when we talk about learning development, I think it is learning to be able to find its way to you when you need it. So imagine if you have this whatever hub or learning space or whatever, that system will know who you are, where you are, what your preferences are in terms of when you learn, how you learn, what type of materials you typically engage with, what your development plan is, what your next role is. All these data. I mean, it's fascinating because you can glean, or you can get insights. The system could get some insights into what you would need, what's beneficial, and that would be based on some other data streams about effectiveness of that training, blah, 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 and then boom, here you go. This is what you need in the moment. So I think it is having smart systems that can better position learning, better position, or we say learning, or performance kind of support solutions that will kind of move you along the way. So you don't have to do a lot of digging. And I wonder what I need. And now you could do a lot of the searching, because the truth is that today people are spending a lot of time figuring out, what do I need, right? What's coming? What are the skills? But I think the big change we hopefully will see is that the technology, the wonder of technology will help you be more effective and efficient in learning. So I think those are some of the trends I'm seeing is just how technology will revolutionize. And it's not going to be only learning. It might also be kind of personal data that feeds into it, and it's like big data stuff that's going to have an impact.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of, I attend a lot of insurance company conferences for different reasons with regards to applied behavior analysis therapy. And they talk about this move from generalized medicine to precision medicine. And if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like learning is really going to move from some of those group statistics that we were talking about to more of what you were discussing, personalized learning.
Exactly. I think that is going to be, I mean, we're already seeing some early indicators of that with people getting stuff based on who they are, where they are, what they like, what they don't like, all these kind of, it's fascinating. Now there's always that kind of ethical, how do we, and then what do we do with the data? So that's another topic, but I think, yeah, it's going from kind of the generic to truly what is close to what we, when we talk behavior analysis, what's right for you, right? It's looking at meeting you where you're at and take you from there. So that is, I think it's principles of our science that is kind of, it maps or matches up nicely against that.
Yeah, I think that would be so cool I guess cool, and as you alluded to, maybe dangerous ethically, if the system knew what your reinforcers were, what type of schedule of reinforcement your behavior should be on, the whole bit. So exactly. Exciting and scary at the same time.
Yeah. Right? Yep, for sure.
How did that, now that we mentioned the term precision, I don't know if this is a great segue or not, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with a book called Precision Selling by Joe Leipel. He was a behavior analyst, and he wrote a great book called Precision Selling, and he took a behavior analytic viewpoint to training sales teams. And I know that's where you started at Kellogg. So could you talk a little bit about your experience training sales teams, specifically in retail sales, and how you infused OBM into those practices?
So that was really fun. So I spent about 3 or 4 years in our sales learning development group. And that was paradise for behavior analysts, because there were like 3 or 4 of us, or 4 or 5 of us, with PhDs and from Western, right? So we were all there together. So you can imagine the fun we're having, because we can really address learning opportunities from that behavior analytic approach. And our programs were built with that, and based on that, if you will. And we had I have huge respect for them, the folks I worked with. I learned so much, and we're a great group. From a retail sales perspective, it was really, it started, we broke it down and let's talk about the role of a retail sales representative, for example. We just need to identify what are the behaviors that make up a successful retail sales representative. So the starting point was really to mapping out that process, right? What happens and what's a day in the life of like, right? We just had individuals who were senior in the retail sales organizations, VP, all the way down to the folks who would do our merchandising. Spend 2 or 3 days with them in a room and map out the whole process. First you do this, and then here are the skills, and here are the things you do, here are the behaviors. So we had this massive process map of a day in the life of. Now then we took that and converted that into a week-long, highly immersive simulated training or learning experience. Right. So what we did is, there were a few days, early in the week where we actually did some baseline. We generated some baseline, took some baseline data, with giving people a store called challenge. Right. We give them some promotional information, some brand information. Here's information on your store, so on and so forth. And here you go and sell. And we had actually built the team had built a grocery store simulator. So we had a grocery store on site. We had it was kind of high fidelity environment with the back room where a coach would sit and observe on video on a screen, because we had video cameras all throughout the store. And he could also communicate with the person who was going through the challenge.
Wow.
About prompting, feedback in the moment. The person was able to ask questions that they needed help, things like that. So highly immersive experience. That they were in their actual work environment, right? It was not simulation in a classroom or some manufacturer. It was they had product there, they had backroom, they had all the equipment, so we could simulate the day pretty well. So that we did the day one thing, and just to see, and we had very specific behavioral criteria on what are they doing, and we set the bar to, by the end of the week they need to reach this point, right? They need to 80% or whatever criteria we had, and then the week was all about. There was classroom, there was interactions, and one thing I was very proud of from a behavior analytics standpoint, we had some fluency training built in there, because some of these skills were being able to sell in an incremental display or selling something new to a store manager. And we identified through our data, after having run a few of these sessions, is that people were struggling. They were not fluent enough to be able to answer objections in the moment. So we had fluency kind of building elements as part of the program. And then towards the end of the week, people were actually giving us another store called challenge, and they needed to pass with a certain criteria. So they were on their own in that environment that, by the way, they had practiced all week. And interesting to say, but actually last week I got an email from a gentleman who came through this program 7 years ago. And he was just letting me know that he was moving on to a different company, but he was actually attributing a lot of his success with Kellogg because he had progressed to that training program. He said it was transformational, right? To actually go through something where it was designed around particular skills and behaviors that showed him actual results, right? They were able to complete that. They were able to sell in successfully. So that whole kind of simulation-based training with fluency elements, with really well-defined criteria, I think reflecting on my career at Kellogg was probably the most fun I've ever had, because you were seeing a really, really meaningful change happen over the course of a week, and just getting success stories from people after they left. So really rewarding for us to have this program, and we ran it for several years. So very successful, but it was, to be honest, it was expensive, because you fly people in, and then you had to have a lot of facilitators and coaches. So it is the ideal, I think, in my opinion, ideal way of train, because you can put them in a real environment, give them immediate feedback and coaching as they go through it. But again, it does take some resources to make that happen.
Absolutely. And, I was really excited to talk to you about this, because when I was an undergrad and in graduate school, the way I paid my bills was I worked retail sales selling cell phones at cell phone companies and cell phone plans and things like that. So I wanted to ask about some of the unique challenges that come into play with regards to retail sales specifically. So I would imagine it'd be difficult to do in vivo feedback, things like that, if you've got a customer right in front of them, things like that. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges of retail sales versus other sales?
Yeah, so I think, true, it is challenging to do and simulate some of those. And the way we got around with our simulations is we brought in retired Kellogg direct sales directors to actually play the role of the customer. So we created those situations, because you can't do that. Now, some of the challenges is, there is relatively, compared to other roles, relatively high turnover, right? So whatever training, whatever, skill building you're doing, you need to have a program that can really get people up to speed quickly. Other challenges, obviously, you're geographically dispersed with your folks, with your learners, right? How do you reach them? How do you give them the attention they need? And some of the approaches we've also, and this was after I left, but to have also equip managers to be better coaches, to be better mentors, and really spend time with them in the store, role model some of the behaviors in interaction with decision makers, with the customer. So yes, some of those are just kind of challenges that are kind of logistical in nature, if you will. But yeah, I remember turnover was one of them, And it's a demanding job. It's physically demanding for people to go out, store to store, and there's merchandising involved. There's a physical aspect to the job. So those would be some of them that come to mind.
I would imagine, yeah, and I remember there being a lot of physical challenges as a retail sales associate because you're on your feet the whole day,
Yes.
Constantly moving around. And there was a lot of, I remember at some of the stores that I worked at, they had requirements of the amount of seconds from when somebody walks into the door to the time that you greet them. So you have to greet them within a certain period of time. And then you had a script that you would have to go through. Did you script a lot of those sales calls, or did you work on generalization a little bit? How did you work that?
Yeah, so we worked on the generalization piece. So we had a lot of, because we had a particular model, right? So when you're engaging with the stakeholders, here's the SPARK process. So the S stood for, start the conversation, and then we had some conversation starters, right? These are great, open-ended questions they can use. So we provided a lot of kind of prompts around each of the step in the process, right? You get to, present your facts and articulating some things and overcoming objections. And for that, we really wanted to make sure that it wasn't scripted per se, but we gave them a model, right? It gave them kind of heuristic or kind of a process to go through with some suggested phrases and keywords. But then again, that's where it's hard to navigate those conversations because the responses you get are different. So if you want to, you can't. I mean, it's where generalization comes in, right? You need to be able to generalize how you're going to respond to objections or questions or things like that. And what helped us through that was, again, adding some fluency building in, right? So if you come back at me with, no, I'm not going to buy this because of X. I'm not going to buy this because of Y or Z or whatever objection there is, we need to make sure they were equipped to handle them and overcome them. And that's why, we had kind of rapid fire practices and really getting them to a point they could overcome these objections or respond correctly in their sleep almost, excuse me. So yeah, that was interesting and fun when we identified, they're not really, they can respond, but they're hesitating, and there's always this delay from that objection until they need to think through something. We need to reduce that latency and just really get them up on their toes and able to respond quickly.
Ever since I got into OBM, I see everything in my life as a balanced scorecard, and the different measures that you look at. And when I was in retail sales, we would have, some stores had specific numbers that we would have to hit, a quota that we would have to hit. And then other stores would have a quota plus how we got to that quota. So they didn't want any shady sales practices. So did you ever focus on that? Not just, the sales quotas themselves, but how they obtained their numbers?
Yeah. So I can also probably speak about this from a broader Kellogg perspective, broader organization, as we talk about exactly the what, right? You're getting to your numbers, but we also talk about the how. So for example, from a performance management standpoint, this applies in sales and it applies in, everywhere, right? We're consistent with this. So you set certain goals for the year, and are you meeting them? Yes or no? But then for your ratings and for your company, your bonus and all that, we factor in, how did you get there? Did you do that in an ethical manner? Are you living our Kellogg values and demonstrating our core competencies and you doing them the right way? So it's not only about that outcome, that number, right? Yes, I hit my quota or I improved or whatever. Managers also need to be able to say, yeah, how they did this is I understand what that was, and I can see the full picture. Which obviously in certain areas, like if you're in sales or something, there are temptations, right? I can cut corners or I can do something that's questionable. So we want to make sure we hold people accountable for not only the results, but also how they get there.
How did you, so one of the struggles that I see in my consulting life is when we talk about ethics is how to measure ethical performance. So how would you measure whether or not a sales representative sold ethically?
So that's a great question. We're actually, so in our performance management, how we tee that process up and how we prepare managers to do that, we have certain, I would say they're not specific, but we have some guidelines around the how, right? So it's not like, the guidelines are, yeah, did they meet the goal? And then we just add that how on top. But it's more subjective at that point. We give them guidelines, right? Did they apply? Are they living the K values? Are there any concerns about, what they did? So the metric is, it ultimately rolls up into a performance rating. As a manager, I'm not going through and on each goal or each behavior, I'm not saying ethical or not. We don't get to that granular level. But we are at a very high subjective level, I'd say, setting expectations like, think about this, think about the how, and do you have concerns? And if you have concerns, it may impact or should impact the rating of that employee. But measuring ethical behavior, we do have other processes through our kind of legal and compliance part, team that they send out some code of conduct and some questionnaires that kind of gauge the organization overall. Are they seeing things that they might be ethically questionable or things like that? So there are other avenues of gauging that, but I would not be comfortable saying, yeah, we got this. I know exactly how to do that, but we don't. But we try with at least setting some expectations.
Yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with that. I know that was a tough question there, but
no, it's a good question.
A lot of people struggle.
Yeah.
So one more thing about retail sales quickly is I've noticed a shift in reference to training and sales industries where there's a shift now from brick and mortar retail sales trainings to online sales where people are selling via virtual chat like we're doing right now. Do you see that same trend occurring? I've also heard that now there's a trend of people going back to retail. So where do you see that happening?
Yeah, so I haven't been super close to our sales operations and sales team for the last probably 3-4 years. But what we are seeing as e-commerce is the big thing, right? We're building a lot of skills and building out teams that handle that specifically. So we have experts in that. How do we engage the consumer? How do we engage the customers through those channels? So there is a huge shift to you have to win in e-commerce if you're going to survive. That's just the way it is, right? But then again, to your point, yes, some are going back to kind of more brick and mortar because what's the experience? What do you want to provide? What's your brand? What do you stand for? So in some cases, you need to have that in place. But I think probably 99% of organizations who sell some sort of services or products, they have an online presence and they need to be able to sell through that. And how they do it differs. But I think in our case and other organizations in this space, everybody's going after this thing, right? Because we, not only your grocery shopping, right? You can get everything shipped to your door now, and the whole channel or the kind of, if you want to call it, supply chain of from you ordering something and getting it to that has changed dramatically. So it's a must-have, I think, if you're in sales these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that a lot now where I found myself shopping on Amazon for food. And I've never done anything like that before. Right. So I would imagine there's a lot of challenges around making sure that there's pictures of the ingredients labels and things like that.
Yeah.
Right?
And I've been in some meetings internally and some big kind of sales conferences where they're talking about kind of how do you make sure that your picture floats to gets in front of people because they're not walking a physical environment where they will technically have the ability to see everything. You can't see everything on Amazon. So as again, going back to what we talked about earlier on kind of personalization, how does the system know who you are and how to cater to your needs? So very challenging, but a fascinating space to be in.
Great. I'd like to, before we close, and I'd like to get to what you're currently working on in a few minutes, but I'd like to ask one more question about learning and development. Do you ever run into situations, so I see a lot of the time, and I think we see this in society in general, where something bad happens and then the immediate suggestion is they need to be trained better. So it's always, there needs to be better training. I watch a lot of sports and they always say, oh, well, they need to coach them up. They need to add more training here, add more training there. Do you run into circumstances at Kellogg where training isn't the answer?
All the time. And to be honest, probably in the majority of cases where we have performance gaps. It is a knee jerk for people and for leaders to, I get so many calls and emails like, hey, we have an opportunity, or we need to fix this, we need to train the problem away, or we need to train people to be, and it makes sense because you're observing somebody and they're not doing what they're supposed to do, and we got to train them, right? But one thing that I've tried always to do is to coach our learning teams, my team, and leaders also, is to think outside of that, right? It's really using, if we go back to OPM, is Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, or what Carl Binder has now updated into kind of the 6 boxes, right? That is kind of the way I think about everything I do. So I have certain models in my head and certain frameworks, some rule governed behavior going on there with how do I approach, how do I take in, how do I manage an intake process? So if you are an OBMer or a learning professional or HR, you need to understand kind of the bigger context and have something like those tools I mentioned, or the behavior diagnostic checklist. And, we OBMers, we have a lot of those tools to get you to where you need to focus. Is it a matter of, better expectations, clarifications? Is it a feedback element? Is it a tool element? Is it, individual kind of capacity, mental, physical? What is it? So what we try to do is to make sure that we have that intake and kind of check of, are we getting to the solution we need? Do we need just a quick job bait? Do we need to, make sure that tool is not breaking every time that people need to use it? And that's driving it. It has nothing to do with training. Training obviously is often a critical component, but you need to do that then in conjunction with the other things. So if we're approaching learning and said, hey, we need to build this skill here, we need to think about the training component. But what are all the other elements that contribute? What are all the environmental factors that we can influence, right? Whether it's building then capability of or skills for the managers of the people that are going through this, or again, improving the technology and the tools. And so it's to answer your question, yes, we get those questions all the time where give me the training to solve my problem. But we always need to kind of time out, let's talk, right? Let's see what's going on. Do you have some data? Can we interview people? Can we observe? Can we see what's really going on before we take the training route?
Do you find that you run into policy or regulatory roadblocks when it comes to training? Where I like we talked about earlier, I started my professional behavior analysis life working in homes for adults with special needs and working in the therapy realm. And a lot of the times we would run into government regulatory roadblocks where we'd say, okay, we think if we make these changes, and we would do like a dirty process map. Before I knew what a process map was, I would do it. And I would show me listen, if we make some changes here and make some changes there, it would really make a difference. But there would be policies and regulations that would stipulate that we would have to train people on certain things. And it would go back to that notion of, there's a problem, okay, well, you need to train them. And it was just a box that needed to be checked. And as long as that box was checked, everybody was okay. So do you ever run into those policy or government regulation issues?
We do, and that's mostly in our kind of hours, which is, for all the right reasons, I guess, is, safety, right? Everybody needs to go through this. And recently I helped a little bit with pushing out kind of safety training for 30,000 employees that was just delivered, face-to-face. And there is also around the legal and compliance, all the kind of ethical stuff, that is a lot of the check the box, because yes, an agency or federal authority, requires you to be able to, if they walk in, and you need to be able to show that people have been trained on this stuff. Our manufacturing environment, right? That's heavily, it has to be, we're in food, and we do have, very powerful teams here and a lot of expertise on how we manage safety overall. And it's not only training, but sometimes, yes, training is the box you need to check. Sometimes we also may have, unions that become part of the challenges with this, or over in Europe, we have work councils that if you're going to implement something, you need to go through all that rigor of vetting and things like that. So yeah, sometimes it's check the box just to make sure yep, we did, and we told them, so don't blame me.
Yeah.
Takes the responsibility away from you and to some extent.
Absolutely. So I wanted to wrap things up by just asking you a little bit about what you're working on next, and if you've got any public appearances or talks or panels that you're going to be on or anything like that. But I'd like to start off with what are you working on next at Kellogg or professionally in general?
Yeah. I've got several projects going on. One of them is very exciting. So I'm leading a project that we're implementing kind of new training process structure and certification of all of our operators in our 50 plus plants globally. So how do we make sure that, everybody we hire in to make our food goes through the right training and is getting the right feedback and coaching and is signed off on observable behaviors, right? Because before that we say you're qualified, they need to be able to show that. So we're implementing a process, lay some technology on top of that to make sure that we have better visibility into qualifications. Who should be able, who's qualified to do the job and who hasn't been trained. Right now we do have processes, but they're somewhat fragmented. They're not enabled by technology. We have limited visibility. So that's been a lot of fun to go and work with the supply chain side of the business to get this stood up, because the culture within supply chain is different from, let's say, marketing and others. So you're always learning more about how we operate and how you need to do differently or not differently when you approach different audiences. So that's another big thing. We're also moving more of our training into virtual spaces, right? We have some new first-time people manager training that is fully online through e-learning, through virtual interactive sessions. We're also converting our onboarding program. So when we, regardless of where you are in the Kellogg world, if you're joining us in Singapore or Mexico or Michigan, we're building an experience that's going to be consistent. You can go through the same things and activities that will get to know the things you need to know, do the things you need to do, and get the feeling that we'd like to create as you join the company. So doing those things at scale is what we've really been focusing on, because again, overall, we are moving from highly or very resource heavy approaches to everything. Bring people together, they fly in, something like, but now we can't do that, because if we're hiring thousands of people every year, who's gonna pay for everything? Who's gonna facilitate everything? Who's gonna, so now we're being smarter with that. So several projects that is kind of helping us get scale with cost-effective, and efficient solutions. So those are some of them that I'm working on.
It's great too, because you sound so passionate about it. You've been working at Kellogg basically since graduate school, and
yeah.
Seeing that type of retention is really fantastic, because there's so much turnover at so many different industries. I would be remiss if I didn't ask about nutrition a little bit. So the reason I'm bringing that up is recently I went through the keto diet with my girlfriend, and she's a behavior analyst as well. So we've been tracking all of our measurables and things like that. So from a training perspective, working in the food industry, do you regularly focus on trainings on subject matter expertise and new things that are coming out? So a lot of boxes now say things like gluten-free or non-GMO, things like that. Is there a big focus on that now?
There's a huge, I'm not directly involved in that, but we have, there's a huge focus at Kellogg in our R&D and across the business on we're a food company, right? And looking at, whether it's plant-based protein, microbiome, it's really getting into the science of food. And we've made some big investments and have some focus areas on how do we get better at that. Our products are continually being evolved, whether it's, less sugar, more protein, more the whole grains, all that stuff. There's a lot of focus on that overall. We're investing heavily in our, we actually, one of our brands is Morningstar Farms, which, veggie burgers and plant-based kind of meat substitutes. So we're really, over the past few years, it's been kind of refocusing on how we started as a company. W.K. Kellogg founded the company it's a health food company, right? And we're really been focusing on getting back to those roots and being cognizant of what we, how we create our food and what goes into it.
That's fantastic. That's great that you have mission alignment from the very beginning, the inception of the company till all the way now. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thor, it's been great having you. Thank you so much for doing the interview. I can't tell you how much I appreciated it. I got to learn a little bit about sales and learning and development, and in the retail sales business and in the food industry. So we hope that our audience enjoys it as much as I did. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Adam. Greatly appreciate it. It was fun.